When you're making your back stay, one of the things you may notice with this pattern is that we have a very shaped center back seam. So depending on if you fit your jacket, you may have altered this back seam. So I measured my stay to be 7 inches down from the cut edge of my jacket on the back. When I lay my seam line for my center back seam on my folded stay fabric, you'll notice down here that I actually am not lined up. So that means there's a little more space down here. I could probably go ahead and mark this and cut it out, and that little bit of extra in the back wouldn't make a huge difference. But again, maybe it will. So one of the things that I could do is I could unpin my pattern and I can shift it down so that I have the seam allowance still. Make sure I'm on my straight of grain, and I can pin it back. And now what I'll do, instead of cutting my back stay on the fold, I'm going to cut my back stay with seam allowance, and we'll end up overlapping those seam allowance because we don't want to stitch it. We don't want to add extra bulk to that center back. So we're going to end up overlapping it. One of the other things I wanted to point out when you're making your back stay is this is my original pattern. What I don't show on here is that I added the 1.5 inches. I had a full 1.5 inches seam allowance on the shoulder. I still have just a 5/8 on the armhole, but I have a 1 inch seam allowance on my side back seam. So I'm going to want to make sure that I use my ruler, and I've got my seam allowance marked on my pattern already, my stitching line, I should say. So I can go ahead and mark my 1.5 inches seam allowance on this stay. That. I can add my 1 inch down here. I think you still see it. My 1 inch seam allowance down here. And now I'm going to use some tracing paper and a tracing wheel and put it underneath the line I've drawn for the bottom of my stay. Excuse me. And I will follow my original neckline. And then I can cut my stay out with seam allowance at the center back so I can overlap it. Again, this is just another way to be able to cut the stay for the back of your jacket. So I have cut out my back stays. I decided on this jacket that I'm going to do the overlap method at the center back instead of cutting it on the fold. So I marked my 5/8 inch seam allowance back here on the center back. I also put my other markings on. I put my triangles on, which are my markings at the neck. I use a dot when it's a small circle, and I use a plus sign when it's a large circle so that I know the difference between the two. And even though these things are marked on my back already, my fashion fabric, I want to mark them again because I'll see them, the thread marking, the tailor tacks that I did from the right side, but I won't see them from the wrong side. So it's just marking again is never a bad thing. So when I go to sew this stay together, I am going to line up my stitching line because I'm overlapping. This is a lapped seam because that's the flattest it can be. Now, I cut this in 2 pieces because I thought the shaping would be easier to deal with. With 2 pieces overlapped, I kind of can get the shaping in there. I have to line up. Here's my seam line on the bottom. There's my seam line on the top. I do want to match them up. So this isn't going to lay exactly flat, but the back of the jacket with this shape seam doesn't lay exactly flat. Again, if you fit yours and altered the center back seam and took some of the shaping out of it, you can probably cut this stay on the straight. And I mean on the fold. You could, even with the shaping in here, have cut this on the fold. It would have made it a little wider down here at these ends, but we could have adjusted that otherwise. So I'm going to go straight stitch this down right on my seam line. Then I'm going to be back and show you how to place it on the jacket.